The fork slipped from my fingers and hit the edge of my good china, and I remember thinking, of all the moments in my 63 years, this one would be the one I'd carry forever. It was a Sunday dinner. My idea, actually. I'd spent the whole afternoon making pot roast the way my mother taught me, with the carrots and pearl onions and that little splash of red wine that makes the whole house smell like something worth coming home to. I wanted it to feel like family. I wanted it to feel like the holidays we used to have before everything changed. My daughter-in-law was sitting across from me, picking at her salad like it had personally offended her. My son was on his phone. And I was trying so hard to keep the conversation light. The weather, the neighbor's new dog, whether we'd all get together for Thanksgiving. Then she looked up. She didn't raise her voice. That's the thing people don't understand about truly cruel people. They don't need to. She just set her fork down very slowly, tilted her head at me with that particular smile she had, and said, "So you're still not working? How long has it been now?" 8 months. I said, "I stepped back from the clinic, yes. My knee surgery took longer to recover from than expected." She laughed. Not a big laugh, just a small private one, like we were sharing a joke that I wasn't quite smart enough to be in on. "I just think," she said, looking briefly at my son, "it must be hard, to feel that useless at your age." The table went quiet. My son didn't say a word. I picked up my fork. I took a sip of water. And I smiled at her across my own dinner table in my own home. And I said, "Funny you'd bring up usefulness. I've actually been meaning to have a conversation about that very topic." She had no idea what I meant. Not yet. My name is Maureen, and I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant. The last 12 of those as a senior consultant for a firm that handled federal litigation support. I've sat across from corporate executives who thought they were untouchable. I've watched men in $1,000 suits cry when they finally understood that I had found every single thing they'd tried to hide. I retired 2 years ago on my own terms, on a good day, with a party and a card signed by 40 people who respected me. Then I had knee replacement surgery, and I moved a little slower, and I stopped wearing my good blazers every day, and apparently somewhere in that transition, my daughter-in-law decided I had become irrelevant. Her name is Kayla. She married my son Connor 4 years ago in a ceremony I paid for. Not because I was asked, but because Connor came to me quietly 3 weeks before the wedding and said they were short, and I wrote a check without making him feel small about it. That's who I am, or who I tried to be. In the beginning, Kayla was perfectly pleasant, polite in the way that people are polite when they're still deciding what they want from you. She called me on my birthday. She sent a Christmas card. She laughed at my stories, even when they ran long. Then they moved into my house. It was meant to be temporary. Connor had taken a new job that didn't start for 6 weeks, and they'd already given up their apartment lease, and I have 4 bedrooms, and I live alone, and it made sense. That's what I told myself. It made sense. I had the space. They needed the help, and I wasn't the kind of mother who kept score. 6 weeks became 4 months. 4 months became 2 years. I never asked for rent. That was my choice. I want to be clear about that. I told them up front, stay as long as you need, save your money, get yourselves established. What I didn't expect was for my home to slowly, quietly become hers. It started small. She rearranged my kitchen. I came downstairs one morning, and my cast-iron skillet, the one my mother gave me, the one I've used for 40 years, was gone, replaced by some ceramic non-stick set she'd ordered online. When I asked about it, she said, "I thought you'd like something easier to manage, with your knee." I found my skillet in the garage. Then she started having her friends over without asking. Not occasionally, regularly. Every other weekend there were strangers in my living room, drinking my wine, leaving rings on my coffee table. When I mentioned it felt like a lot, she told Connor I was being hostile to his social life, and Connor came to me, very carefully, to suggest I try to be more welcoming. I said, "Connor, this is my house." He said, "Mom, she's my wife." He said it like those two things were in conflict, like they had to be. I let it go. Again, I was very good at letting things go back then. The money piece took longer to see clearly, partly because I wasn't looking for it, and partly because I trusted my son. Connor had always been good with finances, careful, responsible, the kind of kid who saved his birthday money instead of spending it. So when he mentioned that Kyla was helping manage the household accounts, I didn't worry. Connor added her to my household utility auto-pay account so she could keep things organized while I was recovering. That made sense. What I didn't know was that she'd spent 3 months slowly shifting which accounts things were drawing from. My cable bill, my internet, my lawn service, all of it quietly redirected to pull from a joint account she and Connor held, an account I had no visibility into. The money was still getting paid. I just didn't realize that the credits she was logging didn't match the amounts leaving my personal checking. I only found out because of my neighbor, Harriet. Harriet is 81 years old and has lived next door to me for 22 years. She's sharp as a tack and doesn't have a diplomatic bone in her body, which is why I love her. She came over one afternoon while Kayla was out, sat down at my kitchen table and said, "Maureen, I have to tell you something, and I need you not to get upset at me for saying it." She told me she'd seen Kayla twice in 1 week, coming out of the attached garage with boxes, my boxes, the ones I kept in the storage side, my mother's silver, some of my late husband's things, a box of first edition books I'd been collecting since my 30s. She put them in her car, Harriet said, both times. I didn't say anything because I thought maybe you'd asked her to move things around. I had not asked her to move anything. I went to the garage that afternoon. 3 boxes were gone. I know because I'd labeled them myself in my own handwriting with a black Sharpie. The shelf where they'd sat had dust rings where they'd been. I stood in that garage for a long time. And something shifted in me. Not anger exactly. I'd been angry before, and anger makes you sloppy. What shifted was something quieter, more like a decision. 31 years of forensic accounting, and I'd been walking around my own house with my eyes closed. Not anymore. I didn't say a word to Connor or Kayla. I went upstairs, I opened my laptop, and I started doing what I had done every working day for 3 decades. I started following the paper trail. What I found over the next 6 weeks was methodical and ugly and, if I'm honest, impressive in a deeply disturbing way. Kayla wasn't impulsive. She was organized. She had been building towards something. The boxes from the garage had been sold. I tracked 2 of my mother's silver pieces to an online resale platform, a local one, the kind people use to sell furniture and estate items. The listings had been taken down, but the account was still there. The username was a variation of Kayla's maiden name. The items sold for $340 and $215 respectively. A first edition I'd paid $600 for in 1998 went for $90, which told me she didn't know what she had, just that she had it. That was $645, petty in the scheme of things, but it was enough to tell me what kind of person I was dealing with. The utility account redirects were more sophisticated. She'd been crediting my household ledger, which she now managed, at amounts slightly lower than what was actually being withdrawn from their joint account. The difference was small each month, $40 here, $60 there. Over 19 months, it added up to just over $1,400 that had passed through my household finances in a way that would be very hard to explain cleanly. But what stopped me cold was the car. Connor drives a truck, a good one. He bought it 2 years ago, and he told me he was making monthly payments on it. What I found when I pulled the title history was that the truck had been refinanced 7 months ago as a higher loan amount against a credit profile that included my home address as a primary asset reference. It wasn't fraudulent on its face. Connor lived here after all, but the refinancing had been arranged by Kayla using a lender I'd never heard of, and the paperwork listed household property in a way that was, let me put this carefully, loosely worded enough to be a problem later. I had it looked at by a real estate attorney, a friend from my working years, a woman named, well, I'll just say she's someone I trust, and she's very good. She looked at the refinancing documentation for 11 minutes and then said, Maureen, this isn't accidental. I said, I know. She said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to be ready. I spent 4 more weeks getting ready. I photographed everything. I made copies and kept them at Harriet's house. I tracked down the sold silver pieces. One of the buyers still had the listing confirmation with the account information. I documented the utility discrepancies with bank statement comparisons going back 19 months. I had my attorney review the truck refinancing and draft a formal assessment of the property reference issue. I built a file, a clean, organized, cross-referenced file, the way I'd done 100 times before for other people's problems. Then I waited for the right moment. I didn't have to wait long. The Sunday dinner was my idea. I invited them deliberately. I made the pot roast. I set the good table. And when Kayla said what she said, it must be hard to feel that useless at your age, I let it land. I let the table go quiet. I let Connor sit there with his eyes on his plate. And then I smiled. Funny you'd bring up usefulness, I said. I've actually been meaning to have a conversation about that very topic. Connor looked up. I said, I've been doing some accounting this fall, old habit, and I've found a few things I think we should all understand clearly before we go any further. Kayla set her wine glass down. I said, the silver your grandmother's friend admired at Christmas, Kayla. The set with the monogrammed handles. I've located where that ended up. I have the resale records. The color moved out of her face, not quickly, just a slow, steady retreat, like a tide going out. I said, I also have a forensic breakdown of the utility account management going back 19 months, and I've had the truck refinancing documentation reviewed by a real estate attorney who has some concerns about the property references that I think a lender would be very interested in. Connor said, Mom, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I have 31 years of experience finding exactly this kind of thing, I said, still calmly, still at my own dinner table, over pot roast that was getting cold. And I found it in my own home. Kayla stood up. She said something, I don't even remember exactly what, some version of this is ridiculous and you can't prove anything. And I said, I can prove all of it. That's rather the point. Connor didn't say anything for a long time. That was the hardest part. Not Kayla's anger. My son's silence. The way he sat there looking at the table like if he stared long enough, the wood grain might tell him what to think. I had raised that boy. I had driven him to soccer practice and helped him study for his LSAT and sat in the front row at his law school graduation in heels that destroyed my feet and clapped until my hands hurt. And right now he was deciding whether to believe me. He said, Kayla. Just her name, one word. And from the way he said it, from the particular flatness of it, I knew he wasn't asking me to be wrong. Kayla left the table. I heard her upstairs, and then I heard the sound of drawers. Connor and I sat in the kitchen with the pot roast between us, and he put his face in his hands and didn't talk for a while, and I let him have that. He's my son. I wasn't going to rush him. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He said, How long have you known? I said, long enough to be careful about it. He said, Mom, I didn't know. About the silver, about the account, I didn't know. I said, I believe you. And I did. That's not what forgiveness looks like. It's not a sentence. It's a long, slow process, and we were nowhere near the end of it. But I believed that my son hadn't known. What he had done was something quieter and harder to name. He had chosen not to look. He had handed her the keys to my household and told himself it was help, and not paid close enough attention to what was happening to his own mother. That we were going to have to work on. The practical pieces moved the way these things do. Not dramatically, not quickly, but with the particular grinding inevitability of documentation and legal letters and uncomfortable conversations. My attorney sent a formal demand regarding the resale of my property. The total value of what was taken or misdirected, the silver, the books, the utility discrepancies, a few smaller items I'd catalogued, came to just over $9,000. Kayla, through her own attorney, agreed to restitution without admitting anything formally. My attorney told me I could push further. I thought about it. I decided the money was enough. I wasn't interested in a years-long court process. I was 63, my knee still ached on cold mornings, and I had better things to do with my time. The truck refinancing was unwound. The lender, once they understood the property reference issue, had very little interest in keeping that paperwork as is. Connor handled that himself, which I took as a good sign. Kayla and Connor moved out 6 weeks later. I don't know the state of their marriage. I don't ask, and Connor doesn't offer. What I know is that he calls me every Sunday now. He never did before, not reliably. And last month he drove down on a Tuesday for no reason except that he wanted to see me. And we had dinner and watched an old movie. And he fell asleep on my sofa like he used to when he was 17 and came home late and didn't want to make noise going upstairs. I covered him with a blanket I keep on the back of the couch. My mother's blanket. It was still there because Kayla never found it. Harriet came over the following Saturday and I made her coffee and told her everything. And when I finished, she said, "Maureen, I always knew you were too sharp for your own good." I said, "Maybe, but not sharp enough to see it coming." She said, "Oh, nobody's ever sharp enough to see it coming from the people they love. The sharp part is what you did next." I've been thinking about that a lot. My knee is better now. I started walking 3 miles in the morning again, down to the park and back, the same route I did before the surgery. The cast iron skillet is back where it belongs. I've been sleeping through the night. I don't need to be useful to anyone in particular. I never did. What I needed was to stop acting like kindness required me to be blind. Those two things, generosity and clear-eyedness, aren't in conflict. I spent 63 years learning that the hard way, first in boardrooms and courtrooms and eventually in my own kitchen. I set a good table, I always have, but I'll decide who sits at it. I keep coming back to that Sunday afternoon in the garage. The dust rings on the shelf where my mother's silver used to be. The way I stood there in the quiet and felt something settle in me instead of break. That moment wasn't dramatic. Nobody saw it. But I think that's where the whole thing actually turned. Not in the courtroom, not when the attorney sent her letter, not even at the dinner table when Kayla's hands started shaking. It turned in that garage when I made a choice about what kind of woman I was going to be about this. I've thought a lot about what went wrong, and if I'm honest with myself, some of it started with me. Not with what I did wrong. I was generous, and I don't regret that. But with what I stopped paying attention to. I let kindness become a kind of willful blindness. I told myself that noticing things, asking questions, keeping records in my own home would make me seem suspicious or ungrateful or difficult. I was so afraid of being the difficult mother-in-law that I handed someone the keys to my own house and looked away while she used them. There's a kind of passivity that disguises itself as generosity. I know that now. Real generosity has its eyes open. It gives freely, but it doesn't surrender its judgment along with the gift. What saved me, and I mean this plainly, without any drama attached to it, was the work I had spent 31 years doing. Not the credentials, not the title, the actual discipline of it. The habit of following things to their source, of not accepting a number that didn't add up just because accepting it was easier. Of believing that the truth exists in the documents if you're willing to sit down and find it. That's not a professional skill. That's a character trait, and it takes a long time to build, and it doesn't turn off just because you've retired. Connor is the part of this I'm still working through. My son is a good man who made a bad choice. The choice to not look too closely at something that might have required him to act. I understand it. I don't excuse it. Those two things can be true at the same time, And learning to hold them both without letting either one collapse into the other is its own kind of work. Calla understood power. She just miscalculated where it actually lived. She looked at a 63-year-old woman recovering from knee surgery, moving a little slower, wearing comfortable shoes instead of blazers, and she decided that was the whole picture. That is a failure of imagination, and it cost her. What I want anyone to take from this, if they take anything, is that your value is not located in your productivity. It is not located in your job title or your salary, or whether you're currently useful to someone else's plans. It lives in what you know, in what you've built inside yourself over a lifetime of showing up and doing hard things with integrity. Nobody can redirect that into their own account. Nobody can box it up and sell it on a resale platform for $90. I set a good table, I always will, but I'll decide who sits at it.